how do you think that your book is essential for incoming freshmen, and why is it relevant for them to read coming into NC State?
So I know that a lot of freshmen in the student body at NC State are from North Carolina. And I was really honored that they chose the book, partly because I thought it would be a good fit, because while the book is set in North Carolina and a lot of the students here are from North Carolina, this is a part of North Carolina that not a lot of people are very familiar with. So it's a small subset of North Carolinians that have ever heard of Roan Mountain, that have ever heard of Hump Mountain, that have ever heard of Dogtown. So I really thought that I could expand students' knowledge of their own home state by having them exposed to this story. I also think of it as a story about the wherewithal, the persistence, the tenacity of the families that were engaged in this battle, Ollie Cox and Ashley Cook and their family. I hope that that's inspiring to students who are facing challenges as they try to decide what to be when they grow up, what to do with the rest of their lives, how to spend their time productively while they're at NC State. And hopefully it inspires people that are facing challenges that they perceive as insurmountable. Maybe they're not so insurmountable. Maybe if you reach out in your community and you tap every resource that you have access to, you can accomplish more than you thought you might.
So why did you tell this story? What's at stake?
I told the story because it was burning a hole inside of me in that I felt like I was privileged to be in some rooms with people, namely Ashley and Ollie, that I thought more people need to know that there are people like this on the side of the road or up the creek collar in the mountains. They're people of real strength and determination that don't get a lot of attention. But maybe if I tell the story about what I've experienced and getting to know them, it will shine a light on these people of enormous inner resources in a way that may change some perceptions.
When you're changing perceptions, I imagine for future generations, how do we accomplish that?
Slowly. I think that a lot of it comes through personal experience. And for people that are not willing to really explore, sort of get out of their own comfort zone, if you're not willing to do that, you're likely to go through life with your perceptions intact. I think it's a really important part of the educational mission to question orthodoxies and to challenge your own firmly held beliefs. And if you're willing, if you're open to that kind of challenge and self-examination, then every once in a while your world will be rocked and your perceptions will change, and then that can be a model for other people. And there's nothing I like more than having people make assumptions about me that I can blow out of the water. There's something about it that people with their cozy assumptions, I think it's really refreshing to mix it up for them a little bit.
And so I know you've been continuing the fight with the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservation.
Yeah.
So what are the biggest conservation and environmental problems in North Carolina today?
It's a long list. I think that we misunderstand our role in natural systems. And until we have a better understanding of the fact that we are part of a landscape, we are a player in the landscape, we have the power to dominate the other elements of the landscape, but if we think of ourselves as merely one part of a larger system, and North Carolina as one part of a larger landscape, I think it helps us to tackle challenges such as a changing climate, a rapidly changing climate, water quality, water scarcity, so quantity and quality of water, fragmented wildlife habitat. Species need room to move, and they need to have diverse breeding pools, or else you end up with a small gene pool, and species are then very subject to disease that can have catastrophic impacts. In our forests, you see a bumper sticker around that says a pine plantation is not a forest. I think we misunderstand the existence of trees, having trees is not the same as having a forest. We have a tradition of landscape architecture and gardening that's led us to a perception of, say, on this campus, and I don't want to pick on this campus, but the existence of trees and grass is not the same as a functioning ecosystem. It's pretty, and I think prettiness is important. I think beauty is important. I think it can be inspiring, but it's not the same as having an intact, functioning ecosystem. So I think the general understanding of Earth systems is we have a ways to go before there's a general appreciation that everything we do in the ecosystem impacts other parts of the ecosystem, and can, if the impacts grow so large and so disproportionate to the ability of the landscape to absorb them and still be resilient landscapes, we're really playing with our own future as we take risks with the ability of species to persist.
I know that you have been continuing to work on growing national parks and conserving land. How much have you been able to conserve? How much have you been able to raise to conserve this land?
That's a good question. So there are 23 land trusts in North Carolina, plus the Nature Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, and the Conservation Fund. Those are sort of the big conservation organizations. So my land trust, Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, has protected 68,000 acres of land over 40 years. The Nature Conservancy statewide has protected 700,000 acres. So you start to see the numbers are starting to add up. And if you take all of the conservation organizations together, we're really making an impact in the landscape at the landscape scale if you take North Carolina as a unit. Now, of course, North Carolina is a political unit with state boundaries that are artificially drawn. They don't follow ridge lines necessarily or watersheds. I think it would make a lot more sense to have our states be the state of the Neuse River Basin or the state of the Watauga River drainage. That's a more rational way to divide up resources into political boundaries, but we didn't do that. I understand that. But you have a lot of rivers that are born in North Carolina and then travel through South Carolina. They have problems. If all the folks in North Carolina want to use the water for agriculture, folks in South Carolina might be robbed of that resource. So how do you work out equity across political boundaries that don't really respect riverine boundaries and aquatic boundaries? So that's a challenge, but land conservation movement across the country has been enormously successful and powerful, and we don't have a whole lot of resources, but we enter voluntary agreements with landowners in the form of conservation easements, and then sometimes we buy land, and more land has been saved by land trusts over the last 10 years than has been converted by sprawl. So in the aggregate, the conservation community has had a real impact in the landscape, and without it, I think we would have poorer resource planning than we currently have, and that extends not only to protecting beautiful places where we like to hike and play and hunt and fish, it extends to the loss of farmland and our ability to feed ourselves in the future. North Carolina is number 2 in the country in loss of farmland over the last decade. You don't want to be high on that list. That's not one where you want to be number 1. So we need to do a better job of protecting our soil resources if we want to be able to feed ourselves close to home in the future. So that's sort of a concrete conservation challenge that people who don't really relate to the climate challenge can maybe say, oh yeah, I eat food. Maybe it would be best for me to eat food that was grown locally.
So would you say that we're conserving at a linear rate? So is it the same pattern every year? Is it going faster? Is it going slower?
It's a good question. I think that we are having an uneven impact because so much of it depends on funding. And what we saw starting in 2007 was a recession that hammered state budgets across the country. And what we see is a continuing pressure at the federal level on budgeting for land conservation, and we are falling behind our needs. If you take North Carolina as an example, North Carolina is adding about 100,000 new citizens every year. Those 100,000 people moving into North Carolina all want clean drinking water. They all want places to hike and recreate, ride mountain bikes and canoe. We have the same number of resources, have more users of the resource. So there was a very rational system in North Carolina established 20 years ago. When a real estate sale took place in the state, a portion of the deed stamp tax flowed into a trust fund that helped buy parkland and conservation land that helped offset the development of that property. Great system. Unfortunately, the General Assembly eliminated it 3 years ago. So you can see that for students, I think engaging in a multi-pronged effort to protect this conservation funding, it's political, it's economic, it is ecologic. There's so many different ways you can come at our environmental and conservation challenges, and one of the clearest ways for a lot of people to understand is just money. If you have less money, you can buy less land. The state and the federal government do have the authority in the Constitution to seize land for public uses. It's how our roads get built, it's how airport runways get built. We take land from private citizens using eminent domain, and you can do that under the Constitution if it's a justifiable public use. Now you have to pay for it, and sometimes the court sets how much is fair compensation, but it's very controversial, so we really stopped using it for creating conservation land, even though we know what could be a more public use than preserving life on Earth. Pretty grandiose idea, preserving land on Earth, but that's really the conservation challenge for the future, yet we're not using the power of eminent domain. We're using money to buy the priority conservation tracts. I'm okay with that approach, but we have to make sure that those funds exist when lands are available for purchase, or else we are going to fall farther behind.
Is this eminent domain, is it under the U.S. Constitution?
It's in the United States Constitution, yes. So it goes under many names: eminent domain, seizure, and condemnation. So it's highly controversial, and we don't use it anymore. But it comes up every once in a while if a landowner wants to sell their land to the Forest Service to add it to the forest, and the landowner thinks it's worth $1 million, and the federal government thinks it's worth $500,000. They're a long way apart on money. You can use a friendly condemnation process to set the value of the land. As long as both parties agree to use that process to set the value, you're pretty good to go.
So I want to backtrack for a second. So I understand you're from Chapel Hill originally?
Yeah.
So I guess you have the opposite story where from small town guy goes to big city.
Right.
You went from like metropolitan area to
Right.
Avery County.
Right,
For like
to an extremely rural area.
Yeah, can you talk a little about like what really drew you to that area, like your personal motivation? I mean, you've talked about beauty and conservation. But
Yeah.
What drew you? You left your law firm in New York, or I forgot what city, at like 24 or something.
So I left Boston, where I was actually working for a book selling company. So I wasn't practicing law at the time, although I had my law degree already. And I sort of fled Boston to move home to the mountains of North Carolina, where I'd spent my summers. And I really think that the rest of the year I feel like I'm sort of held in abeyance. I'm really a summer creature, and the rest of the year I just wait for summer to come back. It's when the fishing is best and when I enjoy camping the most. So it's interesting, you talked about my move from a metropolitan area like Chapel Hill. What you may not realize is when I was a kid, Chapel Hill was rural. Chapel Hill was a tiny town when I was little, and as it changed in the 70s and 80s and really accelerated in the 1990s, I felt less at home there. And so I felt when I was moving to the mountains that I was trying to recapture some of what my childhood was like, which was playing in tobacco fields at the end of my road outside of Chapel Hill and canoeing on a lake that I grew up on. And as those things started to change and that tobacco farm at the end of my street became a subdivision, I felt a real sense of loss. But I realized that the mountains still had enough rural character and enough scenic beauty to feed me, I hoped for a lifetime. And then, of course, I've witnessed a lot of change in the mountains too, where change is very easy to see in the mountains because you have views for a very long way. So you can tell when the ridge lines are being developed, and you can tell when a rock quarry mine moves into the closest ridge to your sacred place.
So how do you feel the conservation movement can proceed forward in this political and judicial climate that we have today in North Carolina?
Great question. So we are living in a different political climate than when the case took place. And luckily, I think land conservation is fairly nonpartisan. It's fairly appealing to conservatives, progressives, liberals, libertarians. The method that you use to conserve land is not, all those sides probably don't agree on the best way to do it necessarily, or how to create the funding mechanisms. We live in a climate, a political climate, that is constantly trying to put downward pressure on taxation and public investment. And I think we live in a time when a certain segment of the population has lost trust that governmental institutions are worthy of public investment. If you're in land conservation, you trust that, that the agencies established within the government can be good stewards of land that we're protecting. And I know a lot of the people in the agencies within the state and the federal system that are land managers and land stewards, and I have a lot of trust in them. They're very committed individuals. Sometimes they make decisions that, that I oppose, and I've even sued a state agency when they made a decision that I oppose. That's okay. In our system, that is not the end of the world for an agency to be sued by citizens. That is my speech right. And nobody at the agency that I sued was terribly offended that I filed a lawsuit. It wasn't in, you know, it wasn't, I'm not going to say it was unicorns and butterflies and happy every day about it, but these are public servants that are working in these agencies. I believe strongly that we need to have a system of taxation that enables us to support the public good. And what is more good and right and true than our future as a species, as healthy people, drinking clean water with places outdoor to connect to our natural state. So it should be non-controversial. In large part, it's a lot less controversial than the regulatory side of the environmental question. Stream buffer regulations are very controversial. Fracking regulations are very controversial. I'm not involved in those right now. I'm involved in, if we value a piece of land enough, we should have the public resources committed to buy it. Not using eminent domain, we should purchase it in the open marketplace. And that really does appeal to conservatives and progressives alike.
So since the book was written, since all this has happened, I mean, like President Obama last week issued the executive order about coal. But at this point, mountaintop bowling isn't as prominent as it once was. It's, in fact, according to the New York Times, it's more or less extinct. What is the most dangerous environmental MO that you face?
So really good question. I think the sheer size of our population is an enormous stressor on our resources. And if you're drinking a glass of water that in the eastern part of the state, downstream of the headwaters of where that water started, you're drinking water that has probably traveled through septic systems. The more people we have drinking water, the more people we have filling septic systems with waste, the more our water is going to become impaired. I think that is a paramount concern. I also think that while we are reducing our dependency on coal-fired power generation, all of the other ways that we generate energy have a carbon footprint as well. Manufacturing wind turbines does, manufacturing solar panels does, installing solar panels on the large scale on what was farmland has an environmental impact. So I think energy usage is a place that we need to really concentrate. NC State is doing an amazing job right now of reducing their carbon footprint by building energy efficient buildings that are LEED certified. The more efficiently we build in the places that we live and work, the more we can get the cheapest conservation dollar. It's cheaper than buying land, it's cheaper than creating a solar infrastructure for distribution. Conservation really takes the edge off of your carbon footprint, and the more we can do that to reduce emissions, we will have gone a long way to address the part of the challenge that's at least the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, great, great. Good deal.